Welcome to Feminist by Design, a series where we explore what our world could look like if feminists were its architects. I'm your host, Khara Jabola-Carolus. Today, we're talking about removing barriers to funding gender equality. And for us, that means going beyond, quote, women's issues. As we've heard in our previous episodes, protecting gender equality is important during natural and man-made disasters. But right now, it's harder than ever to get money to women's rights and LGBTQ organizations, whether in crisis or peacetime, if they're outside the US. You might be thinking, well, of course, because corrupt governments and fascist dictators are doing everything to keep funding away from change agents. And yeah, true. But on this show, we're all about tracing things to their root. And the root of this tree grows from US soil. If we want to accelerate gender equality around the world, we need to use US funding to disrupt US systems. And we'll need to put our money where our intentions are and actually support disruption. Feminist dissent isn't always pretty. As a community organizer, I try to explain women's equality as common sense. But I also know that feminism, the movement to restore gender equality, is objectively radical. There is no way around it. Gender equality requires the reconstruction of society and our relationships, and that's threatening to many people. It's a total transformation, an inversion of powerful institutions, including our own families. Depending on where you live, patriarchy has been around for hundreds to thousands of years. Feminism is young in comparison. Old systems want to survive. The people benefiting from them don't want to and often won't be convinced to part quietly with those privileges. This is why advancing gender equality was never a peaceful process. Even the fight for women's voting rights was not peaceful. In 1910, when hundreds of women marched through London protesting for the right to vote, they faced violence from police officers and male bystanders. Of the 300 or so women protesting, 200 were assaulted. Some of those assaults were sexual. No men faced charges. In the US, suffragettes faced beatings and in some cases torture as they worked toward earning the right to vote. If we look to the history of Western feminism specifically, the first feminists in France were socialists, and they were poor. The French philosopher who coined the term feminism, féminisme, was socialist. They were all really concerned about how to distribute wealth more equitably. They all faced brutal violence for their activism. We in the West may think that we've left that repressive history behind. But if we're really allowed to be honest, philanthropy can't even touch words like socialist. In the past, socialism was used to trigger anxiety about foreign and Jewish threats. Today, the term is still used to fearmonger, cancel, and dehumanize, with the hopes of preventing dialogue. Philanthropy can say poverty alleviation, economic justice, universal healthcare, basic income, labor rights, economic empowerment, and redistribution of wealth. We can even complain about capitalism. We talk about theory of change all the time. But we aren't supposed to talk about the one theory of change that's been embraced by anti-poverty advocates for over a century. The theory of change that sent a Russian woman to space decades before the United States did. The theory of change that led a country to enact equal pay for women and maternity leave legislation way back in 1917. The theory of change that first inspired Betty Friedan. We can't say it because it's called communism. This fear, created by US policy and institutions, is what we're looking at in this episode. Because anti-communism has profound impacts on gender equality proponents all around the world. The word communism is still used as a weapon. And for some activists fighting for gender equality in certain countries, getting labeled as a communist carries fatal consequences. Let's hear from a feminist who's on the ground.
Well, red tagging is a policy of the Philippine government wherein activists, dissenters, or those who are critical of government laws, policies, programs, and projects are politically vilified. Often, we are made to be connected or linked with the underground revolutionary movement, which the government considers a terrorist organization. In the Philippines, there is an ongoing civil war between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the Communist Party, New People's Army, and the National Democratic Front. Officials, especially high-ranking military officials, say that we are front organizations or supporters of the Communist Party and its New People's Army.
So in the Philippines, anyone who supports progressive change can be considered a communist. This is a problem because communists are considered terrorists. You are tagged as red. And Beverly Longid, who we just heard from, she was first red tagged 5 years ago. And yes, you can be red tagged more than once. Beverly is the global coordinator for the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation. This red tagging policy grew out of U.S. colonization of the Philippines. The Philippines has signed continuous treaties with the U.S. in exchange for independence from the U.S. and for military aid. This means Philippine domestic policy stays in lockstep with U.S. military and economic objectives. This also means that U.S. military aid isn't primarily used against external threats. Despite being one of the top 10 recipients of U.S. military aid for almost 80 years, it's an open secret that the Philippines doesn't have much of a Navy or Air Force. I've seen this firsthand on an official government patrol of its seas. The vessel was a wooden dinghy with a couple of AR-15s. This is because most U.S. military aid has gone to building up the Philippine Army, so it can contain and crush its own citizens who try to organize against the oppressive rule of pro-U.S. regimes. According to U.S. bilateral policy with the Philippines has to cooperate in, quote, whole-of-government coordination across military, civilian law enforcement, and justice institutions to deter and address the root causes of radicalization and resort to violence. This expansive mandate has led to a chilling environment for folks like Beverly Longid.
I have been openly accused by government as communist infiltrators of the United Nations. I've also had my name and my face publicly posted. Some of my colleagues would even have their names posted. Unfortunately for them, some of them have been killed and many are still in jail.
Beverly's had colleagues killed for the same work she does. Last year, 19 of the 81 cases around the world of women assassinated for their environmental justice work were in the Philippines. What's happening in Asia Pacific today is yesterday's McCarthyism on steroids. We talked in episode 1 about the Holy Land Five, as they're now known. The 5 employees of one of the largest U.S. Islamic charities who were targeted during the War on Terror and are still in prison today. But the consequences of the War on Terror impact far more than Muslim and Palestinian charities. An LGBTQ rights organization that provides disaster relief in predominantly Muslim areas of the Philippines was red tagged and publicly named as an armed group. The National Police planted evidence on the Philippines Political Party for Women to red tag its members. Community pantries were red tagged during COVID. A major young starlet, now Hollywood actress, was red tagged after appearing on a women's rights webinar. A webinar. The brightest graduates of the Philippines equivalent to Harvard are routinely disappeared. Even an American, Brandon Lee, had to be rescued out of the Philippines by California politicians because he was shot 5 times into permanent paralysis after getting red tagged in 2019. The Catholic Church of the Philippines has joined in on the terror by branding reproductive justice advocates as Team Patay, which means Team Deceased. Red tagging has spiraled so far out of control in the Philippines, all because laws and policies implemented in the U.S. were pressured onto countries in exchange for U.S. military and humanitarian aid.
Once you are red tagged, it classifies you a combatant. Therefore, you are a target also of this ongoing conflict. And all of the experiences of those who have been extrajudicially killed, those who are incarcerated currently because of false charges, and those who have been enforcedly disappeared have experienced red tagging prior to their killing, prior to their arrest, and prior to their enforced disappearance. And those who have been officially designated as terrorists, They find their financial accounts, bank accounts frozen, and their other properties subject to civil forfeiture.
I want to emphasize the non military financial war on terror. And I also want to emphasize that US laws and foreign policy play a role.
The Philippine government has a counterinsurgency policy, and this counterinsurgency policy is patterned from the US counterinsurgency guide. Even the laws that we have, like the anti-terror law, is also patterned from the US Patriot Act. And all of this we can trace back to what happened after 9/11. So, in other words, we have a collusion between the Philippine state and the US state as far as their war against terror. And when we speak of war against terror, they do not make a distinction between civilians, those who are exercising their legitimate right for resistance and dissent, from those that are armed.
This is such an important point that I want to make sure we really sit with it. These policies that are meant to root out terrorists often target gender equality, women's rights, and LGBTQ groups. This is in a country touted as the oldest democracy in Asia and one of the closest US allies in the region today.
In line with this counterinsurgency policy and its war against terror, the US has also made bilateral agreements with the Philippine government in terms of military agreements like the Visiting Forces Agreement, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, wherein U.S. Military forces conduct military training exercises within the Philippines, and they also provide technical assistance in terms of intelligence training and arms. But basically, it's within this general policy of the US government of war against terror.
Since 9/11 and the war on terror, America and its allies have conflated anti-communism with anti-terrorism. This in order to justify all kinds of repressive tactics leveled against women. It doesn't matter that they may just be providing medical services to victims of gender-based violence. Women and women's rights are often portrayed as victims of terrorism to rationalize invasion, war, and occupation. Like former First Lady Laura Bush said, "The fight against terrorism is a fight for the rights and dignity of women." We fight terrorism because we fight for women, or so it's sold. But women's rights are also victims of counterterrorism.
In 2018, the Department of Justice filed a petition with the Supreme Court aiming to declare the CP Communist Party of the Philippines, its new People's Army, terrorist groups. And recently, with the enactment of the 2020 anti-terror law, they created what we call an anti-terrorism council that has the mandate to arbitrarily declare individuals and organizations as terrorists.
These policies can easily be used in bad faith and to preserve power, rather than fight actual terrorists. That's the point. Creating a culture of fear that isolates change agents and makes them toxic to supporters and funders. It's a violation of US federal laws and illegal in the Philippines to provide material support and resources for someone connected to a designated terrorist organization. The penalty is life imprisonment. This absolutely affects the level of funding to groups fighting for gender equality. So organizations have needed to get creative about how to access funds once red tagged. Many activists and organizers feel these strategies are not safe to discuss. We struggled to find anyone willing to go on the record about this.
I think we have to be very, very careful in the current context because we are seeing a lot of backlash. And it's a really, really tragic time because I think the kind of risks we were taking 10 years ago, we can't do that now. The world has definitely changed drastically, especially post-pandemic, where there is a lot of increased surveillance, even on things like social media, what you're putting out, and the responsibility that you have as a feminist fund. Like my biggest issue is how do I ensure that resources keep coming for 250 plus partners that we have? And it's really hard, right? So I may have certain individual opinions that I would like to take, but then I have to think three times about this. Can I actually make this statement? What would be the repercussions? And that is true with the entire feminist fund community as well, that how do we build up our champions and allies who are working in spaces which are not very easy?
That's Anisha Chugh. She's the executive director of Women's Fund Asia. And she's talking about how saying the wrong thing can really jeopardize an organization like hers. Because worldwide, women's rights organizations only get 0.4% of all gender-related aid, and only 0.42% of foundation grants are allocated to women's rights.
We are seeing a lot of resources, funding being committed for feminist movement building work. But at the same time, we are seeing severe backlash on a lot of the progresses being made. Asia in itself has undergone multiple crises, especially in the last few years. The pandemic really hit labor rights of women across. Domestic violence was at its peak. And we saw the political upheaval that happened, whether it was Afghanistan, Myanmar, the foreign exchange crisis, which happened in the region, in South Asia, and then multiple climate crises, Pakistan, Philippines. When we're looking at the state of polycrisis, the burden of it invariably falls on the movements at the forefront, which happen to be feminist movements, women's rights movements, who are providing not only critical support to survivors, but also to the larger communities. And the resourcing for that, which is flexible, is still not enough. Asia is one of the least funded regions. I think in terms of resourcing, movements are doing some really amazing critical path breaking work, but it definitely requires a lot more funding than what it is being received now. Feminist movements have pretty much been at the peripheries within the funding world, especially those from the global south. The Women's Fund Asia, we have our small grants program, and where we provide a small funding which goes to like 15,000 to 30,000 US dollars. Some get for 2 years. We received some 650 applications last year, and we were only able to resource 20% of the eligible application. And that cuts across, if you look at the numbers by rest of the feminist funds and women's funds who have open calls for applications, they will tell you the same story. It's around 15 to 20%. And that just tells you what the state of funding today is.
And the flip side of this dearth of funding for the feminist movement is ballooning resources for the so-called anti-rights movement that fights it. From 2008 to 2017, U.S. organizations aligned with the anti-rights movement generated a total revenue of $6.2 billion U.S. and funneled at least $1 billion more into countries across the globe.
I think there are multiple reasons for that. Upfront patriarchy. And I think just the way the systems are designed, they continue to be exclusionary. Whether you look at language justice, whether you look at accessibility, the fact that a lot of the critical work that is happening is being led by the activists on the ground with very little resources and against multiple backlashes, right? So they get backlash from the state, from society, from community, from within their own families themselves. In addition to that, they're against a system which is not only patriarchal, but colonial, very white. The constant argument that I hear of not funding women's rights organizations and other feminist groups which are led by trans or intersex persons is that they don't have the absorption capacity. And, it's quite comical because on one hand, no one's ready to invest in these groups. But on the same hand, you say, oh, we can't invest in them because they haven't demonstrated the capacity to manage that sort of money. So it's a vicious circle that a lot of the groups find themselves in.
Then on top of all of that, you have this McCarthyism, making it even more difficult to get money into the hands of feminists. There's a direct connection between foreign policy in the US and feminist organizing in other countries.
So if you mention feminist in your foreign policy, in your assistance policy, it does give us a foot in the door to undertake advocacy around that word and hold governments and individuals accountable to that word. Because to me, the most important principle of feminism is accountability. However, there are a lot of challenges, and there is still continues to be a major disconnect in terms of the context that is there in the global south versus the policies that are being shaped in the north, whether it's at the state level or it's at the foundation level. And the other thing is, I also don't want to just homogenize the South. There are multiple contexts, there are multiple power dynamics, there are multiple identities that exist. They're all cross cutting. And the policies have to be rooted in the context of the communities on the ground. The only way of overcoming that is ensuring the feminist movements have the space at the table to shape these policies directly, whether it's a feminist foreign policy or it's a strategy of private foundation or philanthropy.
Remember Lahaina and the powerful grassroots organizing we talked about in episode 2? It's working because impacted people are working in concert to skillfully pressure government leaders in the middle of the crisis, to the point that Maui's vacation rental industry and water privatization seem like risky things for politicians to support. If we want to use philanthropy for fast and big change, we have to get political, like Lahaina.
Well, I think that's a challenge that every activist has to address to show the legitimacy of our struggle. The challenge also is for activists to be able to explain that dissent can also come in different forms. And people, we also have the right to self-determination. It's not an easy thing to explain. And for many, it's probably not easily understood. I think it is more of a lack of understanding on people's movements or what drives people to resist. And at the same time, a significant number of the population support the line of government. People tend to accept just because it's government or it's a government official speaking, it's the truth. It's not easy. You are fighting a government that has all the resources and the manpower compared to the mass movement, which is a minority.
If we really want gender equality, we have to outfund the opponents of feminist change. We need to fund organizations like Anisha's, who are finding ways to support feminist movements even in these treacherous political environments, and organizations like Beverly's, who are directly challenging oppressive regimes. Feminist movements are some of the biggest drivers of progressive policy change. If we want a more fair world, we need to fund them. Organizers like Beverly understand what's needed to make gains locally that will have ripple effects globally.
We have an ongoing campaign that says our fight, our struggle is just, so they can support that in terms of issuing statements. We also have an ongoing campaign calling on foreign governments to stop sending military aid to the Philippines because these resources are being used to violate the human rights of the Filipino people. And then, of course, we would welcome any kind of material and financial donations that will go to funding the operations or like the allowances of organizers, which is very minimal. You can visit our website of the IPM-SDL through www.ipmsdl.org and our social media accounts for specific campaigns and how you can support this.
And by the way, we have links to these organizations in our show notes, so you can check them out and support them directly. We opened the episode with one of our guiding principles, using U.S. wealth to disrupt U.S. systems. For us in the U.S., there are many opportunities to interrogate and influence U.S. government actions. Restore public funding to diplomacy, not militancy. Make sure feminist foreign policy means more than diplomacy and closed-door conferences, that it means coordinating with mass movements to out-organize warmongering institutions. Support Global South organizations working to repeal domestic anti-terror laws and fight bad faith anti-terror councils. We can pressure our elected officials to put conditions on foreign military aid and to delist progressive organizations from the U.S. foreign terrorist list. I personally want to use feminism to prevent another Cold War. The military-industrial complex is as wide as it is deep. The military-industrial complex is a direct threat to gender equality, and it relies on McCarthyism, like the Philippine government anti-communism efforts, to sell its products. In 1952, Joseph McCarthy accused Mary Devlin Kayserling of being a member of 10 different communist groups. Mary was an economist, a government employee. She advocated for the rights of working women. Today, we would call her a feminist. After working for 3 different presidents, her career was ended by this accusation. 70 years ago, McCarthy was censured, condemned by his colleagues. 70 years ago. Yet today, Congress does nothing to stop the President and Department of State from designating communist groups as terrorists. McCarthyism lives on, and we can change that. Disrupting the status quo is necessary for feminist progress. If we say we support big ideas, then we need to destigmatize radical work. The radical work of women fighting for a better world, moved by big ideas of system change. Join us next week as we look at philanthropists who are using their wealth to challenge the very system that produced their wealth, or as some like to call themselves, class traders. Thank you for listening to Feminist by Design, a podcast brought to you by the Global Center for Gender Equality. I'm your host, Khara Jabola-Carolus. This show was created, executive produced, and written by Maggie Hellis and me. Producing, sound design, and mixing by Elizabeth Nakano. Narrative editing and development by Arwen Nix. Special research and production by Erica Fotheringham. Cover art by Maggie Hellis. To learn more about the Global Center for Gender Equality, check out our show notes.